digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session, and we're coming at you live today from the Jagex Game Studios in Cambridge, where we are joined by Mark, Jim and Pete. Hello guys.
Hey.
Hi.
Hello.
Would you care to explain for our lovely listeners exactly what your roles are within the Jagex building and what you do for RuneScape? Why don't we start with you, Oggy?
So my name's Mark Ogilvie, or Og, and I'm the design director for RuneScape. So I help to shape a lot of the products that we make within the RuneScape multiverse, and kind of a vision holder for the brand.
Okay. Jim, tell us what you do.
I'm Jim, or James Sweatman. I am lead game designer on Chronicle RuneScape Legends and our mobile division at the moment. So looking at ways we can expand the RuneScape brand onto mobile and what we can do there, as well as managing a couple of our other products as well.
Wonderful. And Pete?
My name's Pete, or Pete was born, and I'm a senior game designer, and I work alongside Jim in the same team. So we work together on Chronicle, and also now we're looking at the mobile side of things and see what fun we can make there as well.
Okay, lovely. Now, I'm going to ask you, for the record, because a lot of our listeners may not be from the games industry or understand necessarily things about the games industry, therefore they may not know what RuneScape is. Shock horror. I know,
Well.
it's terrible. In one sentence, can you each explain to me how you would explain what RuneScape is in one sentence each? And I'm going to start with you, because you should know this off the top of your head.
One sentence. That's the tricky bit.
Only one
A
sentence.
sentence would be quite long, right? Depends how many commas you put in there.
Depending on how many times I breathe.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah.
RuneScape is a medieval fantasy adventure game which you can enjoy with lots of friends at the same time, where you level up statistics, gain experience points, get big swords, go off on fantastic adventures and become a hero of a world.
Okay, does anybody have any advance on that one sentence?
Yes.
Bring it, Jim.
RuneScape is the different MMORPG you should be playing today.
Ooh,
Okay, yeah.
nice advert.
Yeah, and I was going to go with RuneScape is the British success story, right?
Ooh.
Because it's over 15 years old now.
Yep.
Okay.
Which
Smashed
is just fantastic, right?
Yeah.
And it's still going strong.
Okay, so for context, I'm also going to add, for the benefit of our listeners, RuneScape is one of those games that if you are into gaming in any way, shape or form and you have played World of Warcraft, at some point in your life you played RuneScape first. RuneScape is kind of like the gateway drug.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone says, "Oh, you're just a WoW clone." Well, technically, WoW.
Yeah, we
is a
were
RuneScape
there
game.
first, guys.
So now that we've got that context and everybody now knows what RuneScape is, I wanted to talk about kind of the storytelling process for something that is an MMO, massively multiplayer online game for our listeners who may not know. But this idea of creating stories for massive audiences who are all participating at the same time. Because I think what's kind of happening at the moment is we've gone through an evolution of different types of storytelling and different types of technology. And we're almost coming full circle back to this idea of collaborative social environments where all the geeks get together and hang out, and all us nerdy types can relive our youth, and this idea of immersive theatre and escape rooms and all these environments where people really get to re-engage with the stuff that they used to love back in the day, like Ian Livingstone's Fighting Fantasy and Choose Your Own Adventure.
Good reference.
It's kind of coming back to the fore. So I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about how you see the storytelling landscape at the moment in terms of what the key tools and the key, fundamentals are in your book when it comes to being able to articulate a story for an audience that may include millions rather than just one or two people. Mm-hmm. Come on, Oggy. I'm looking at you.
That's a bold question.
That's
It's
quite a big one.
We don't ask the easy questions here.
I think something I'd like to say quite early on actually is it's a shame that in the MMO space people you described it yourself as a massively multiplayer online game. Actually, what we are as MMORPGs, they're a very, very different thing, and this slice of the market, our genre, seems to have forgotten about its role-playing heritage. The idea of these kind of rich immersive worlds and characters with stimulating stories that and stories that permeate throughout a world. It's actually much more the case these days with MMOs that they forget about the RPG element, and actually there's less and less stories, decent bits of storytelling in MMOs. What I'm quite enthused by is that actually other games like following on the kind of BioWare coattails, whether it's Witcher 3s or Last of Us, those kind of things where you've really got decent storytelling within that, and it feels like I'm in a proper world and I want to get to know the characters that are in front of me. It's not so much about me and my role within the game, but it's the extended universe. Yeah. And I think you are right in that storytelling's becoming more popular again. I think I look at titles like 80 Days Around the World, the stuff that the Inkle guys were doing, and they're in Cambridge as well, their sorcery, things like that, where even mobile phones are able to tell really good stories now. So it is an interesting space, interesting time for the industry, but I think unfortunately MMOs, apart from RuneScape, seem to have distanced themselves from proper, decent storytelling.
It's interesting that you kind of define that difference as well between the idea of somebody's participation within the universe and playing that role, if you like, and having a contributory impact on the wider universe versus just kind of observing the story that's happening and kind of being carried along in a kind of a narrative observation, in a passive way. What's your take on this, Jim?
I think it's a really big challenge, especially for MMOs, to capture a really interesting narrative that the player can immerse themselves in whilst trying to accommodate hundreds of thousands, millions of players at the same time. And I think RuneScape does it in a really interesting way in that there is part of the game which is a single player RPG in which you're evolving a story, learning the world, and then we have these big events that actually change the world for everybody as well. So you can have players that have gone through a quest line and only maybe one quest in, and they don't know half the story that's to come, and others players are several quests down the line. And I think that's an interesting way of us allowing players to be immersed in a narrative, but then also see a world evolve around them over, say, 15 years of history. So I think RuneScape takes a really interesting take on it. And I think for MMOs or any kind of large-scale RPG, you have to make that decision, because only providing a single-player narrative within a live world, or only providing a multiplayer narrative in the live world, means that you're restricted in the way that you can tell stories. So instead of the character being central to things, which we do in most of our stories within RuneScape, or just a participant in a large-scale event, I think being able to straddle the line and be able to choose between them is really good for players, and also allows our writers to do some really interesting things with narrative. So it's a big challenge, and I think RuneScape's done a really good job of it as an outsider coming into the company, and also seeing what the guys do. So it's going to be interesting to see how people take that up and what they can do with it. I'm personally a big fan of stories of which the creator has woven a narrative that's really interesting and doesn't have to worry too much about millions of players. They just worry about you, the protagonist, and weaving a story around you. But the challenge of providing something for hundreds of thousands of players to be a part of and evolve is something really interesting as well. So the future is up to the writers, I guess, and see what people create.
Okay. So from your perspective, Pete, when we talk about these kind of evolving approaches to storytelling for large audiences, and maybe what some might call kind of event viewing opportunities in terms of these storytelling moments within, I'm not just going to say just MMOs, but any type of immersive storytelling where you're trying to, tell that story for a large number of participants. Yeah. And I'm not saying audience here, I'm saying participants, because I do think there is a significant difference. What do you think is kind of the next step on from just having that kind of collaborative shared storytelling moment to actually making it a meaningful personal experience for each individual?
So I think part of that would be giving the player more of a sort of an input over how a story sort of unfolds, really. So a lot of games obviously have kind of very linear storylines, and you kind of pull along those, and you're set in the middle of them, but you're still restricted to the writer's vision and how that all kind of plays out, and you're kind of there. And I think one of the interesting things will be looking at having the player have a real impact on how a story will unfold and how it progresses. And one of the things that we've been up to recently, actually, we've just released our first Alexa Amazon Echo project. Yeah,
I can't wait to try this.
There it is.
I can't wait to try this.
So that was us taking a quest from RuneScape. So that was one piercing note, and we built that out as purely as an audio adventure. And it's very much, it follows the same design as it's kind of present in RuneScape, but it really does start opening up the question about, what is as a player, what involvement can I have in the middle of this story? What can I decide to do that can maybe impact how it unfolds and how it changes and such like that? And I think that was that's only our first sort of go at it. But I know that for myself and Og, who worked on the project, we're kind of very eager to explore, what the storytelling, what could be done there in terms of the player having more involvement over that, and how that would affect storytelling in general.
Okay. So it's interesting you bring up Alexa, and I'm really curious to hear from your perspective on, we're talking about new technology, and as we emerge into these new different types of technology, be it Alexa or be it AI or VR or AR or whatever the thing may be, how do you see this impacting the way that you tell stories for audiences, and what types of stories you want to tell with that different types of technology? I'm not suggesting that you're led by the technology, but now that you have all of these new tools and these new options and even these new devices available to you, how do you see that changing the way that you're going to tell stories going forwards?
So, for me, I'm a storyteller in my spare time. I love doing that kind of stuff, sitting around a campfire telling stories, or being a dungeon master in a roleplay campaign, something like that. And the limitations of games, as we see them at the moment, is that things follow a scripted path. They are determined to run in a certain way. The joy of storytelling and the joy of role-playing is that you have, when one of my players comes up with a random idea of how they're going to get over the challenge that I put in front of them, I am able to respond to that. I'm able to fill in the gaps and work out how the story that I had written could be disassembled and then presented to them in a different way with different protagonists, antagonists, different things going on. So I find new ways of taking that thread of a story and allowing it to go all over the place. I think that if you assume that AI technologies and, simply the ability to, rather than, there's a calculator on the table here, right? Rather than me write a story about this calculator, the calculator has properties that it has. It has wants, it has desires, it has emotions. And when I put that calculator in the scene, it can work out its place in the story, and it can come up with various different triggers and prompts and
respond differently to different
exactly.
people. Yeah.
So for me, that's the future, and I think that's the thing I'm most excited about. So rather than these kind of scripted experiences, you can allow the pieces of your game to tell the story themselves. And I think that ultimately that's going to be more rewarding for the player, because as we've all said, it's about the player being able to steer that story in crazy ways. I want, if I watch a YouTube video on a great piece of storytelling, pretty much everyone's experiencing the same story. There might be some variance and there might be various different things that go one way or another, but ultimately the story always ends up in the same kind of way. I would like to challenge that. I'd like to be able to, for people to really genuinely craft their own stories. And I think, that's the thing that gets me up every day.
What would you say then in terms of purists who might see AI as a threat to writing and storytelling? In as much as if the AI can do it all, if the AI can come up with a different response for every single person who's interacting with their story and creating a different story, does it leave a role for a writer to actually have that
of course it
restrictive
does.
narrative?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I'm throwing the question out on the table.
Because the AI has to be made by somebody, right? And
Yeah.
it's going to be coded by somebody, scripted, and so the principles of good storytelling should be inherent. You're kind of inside of them, really. I think what's interesting is the variations you get out of it, kind of the originality of content and such like that. I think is quite fascinating. But I don't think it's a cheat. You know what I mean? Like the way you're doing.
So you heard it here first, people. Nothing to panic about. Just don't worry about it.
I think there's two schools of thought as well. As Og was talking about it, the dynamic nature of storytelling can evolve. That could be AI driven. So as you say, attaching attributes to something, and the narrative evolving from that based on the player's interaction with the object or the person or whatever it may be. But there's always going to be a desire for people to seek out a predefined narrative that associates with their particular beliefs or interests and of a writer that they might be interested in. But something that's predefined and crafted for them is always going to be something that's really interesting to them. And I think we're going to be a long way away before an AI can craft those things effectively, but you never know. But I also think the really interesting thing with stuff like what the guys did with the Amazon Echo and things like AR with various devices, and also VR stuff as well, is how it changes the language of narrative. So the detail you can get out from something, how emotive something can be because you're interacting with it in a much richer way. So instead of pressing a button on a user interface, you are talking to the talking the dialogue that it requires you to do, or making up your own, or interacting with it with your hands in virtual space. All of those things make the narrative so much more emotive and personal, and the way that we write narrative, or the way that we write prose, then has to change, because we can be much more cutting, we can be much more biting. All the things that we do could be more emotionally charged because they are much more real. There's less of a jump for the person to make when the character's speaking to you in your room, in your house, and you're directly interacting with them, or if you're facing face to face with them in a virtual environment with your own hands, or virtual hands as it were, or through some kind of AR lens. And that's going to be really interesting to see how people adapt to that and change the way that they write stories, because of how emotive they might be beyond the layers that we have at the moment to tell stories.
Interesting. Some of what you guys are talking about kind of begins to teeter onto the edge of emergent storytelling. I'm curious if you think that there is that solution of kind of emergent storytelling being the next step, if you like, for interactive storytelling.
I see it as just one way of going about it. There's no real reason why you still couldn't have a nicely pre-planned story with an excellent start and 3-act structure and all this kind of stuff. Basically, I think you just have to. I think more so the idea of emergent storytelling, or procedure generated in some way. That's just another form of it. If you see what I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any better or any worse necessarily. It's just a different way of presentation, a different type of story. Really, that's at least that's how I would see it. Basically, it's just the idea of really kind of adding to the arsenal almost in terms of what storyteller and type of story can come out of things.
Okay. Okay, you got a thought on this?
I guess I wanted to respond to what you thought your listeners might be concerned about whether writers feel a threat.
Yeah.
Again, going back to proper traditional storytelling, you hear stories, you have stories which are passed down generation to generation.
Yes.
Those stories change. Those stories change based on the way that society views what the characters are doing in that story. People change those stories all the time. As a storyteller, my favourite time is when I sit around a fire and I hear someone tell one of my stories back to me, and they've changed it in some way, and that is an amazing feeling. And actually, the characters that I've created, they have such strong personalities. I can see those characters still existing within the style of story that they told, and that is an incredible feeling. So I think the challenge doesn't necessarily become the challenge is still. Am I creating quality stories that make sense in the world that I am giving them? So, as game makers, we might say, well, I'm going to give the players the tool to join these things together in a different way, or that the paths between these story beats that I've created is different and meander all over the place, and the player populates that story in a completely different way.
Sure.
Like, I still get my buzz from being a writer. They're still enjoying it. Ultimately, I'm still giving them escapism. I'm still allowing them to immerse themselves in my world. But they're getting so much more out of it. And it is like when we, as games developers, watch people's YouTube videos and look at the things that we have given them and create games out of it and develop this kind of emergent gameplay around, in properties that we've added to the game. That's fantastic. They've made something better than we could have done in the first place.
Yes.
Why would you not want that?
But it's interesting. It's interesting that you're saying this, because you're coming at this from a games industry perspective of being a games writer, whereas there are other types of writers, such as a playwright or a screenwriter or a novelist, who would look at this very much of the idea of, well, I lose control if it's not about me dictating and controlling the narrative. If you guys, it's inherent that you say you give the story to the player, and that's that. I think the inherent difference there is that you're about sharing narrative, whereas other types of writers are a little bit more about, well, I control the frame, I control the picture of what you see and the story that you're being told.
Yeah, you say that, but I look at platforms like virtual reality, for example, and I think that if the story is gripping and it's fantastic, because that platform is so much more immersive. Like if it's like a sci-fi story or something, and you can recreate the middle of a space battle which is raging on in space, put me in the middle of that, then I'll perhaps I wouldn't want to necessarily have any impact on that. I'd be quite happily just looking around and kind of watching this all play out around me, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. So, like I say, I think the player having an input in a story and the story just being totally pre-written and everything else like that, for example, it's just a different form. It's just a different form, and I don't see why they can't necessarily coexist. Like within, like, for example, virtual reality would be a fantastic one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. So, as always, we like to ask a broad, sweeping question, and we're gonna do that once again.
Those work.
No.
Oh, okay.
That was the warm up,
Oh, no.
Jim. That was the warm up. Okay. So
we're going to solve all the problems now.
We want to ask you these broad, sweeping questions, and the question I'm going to ask you today is, what do you think is going to be that thing? Be it a cultural shift or a technological shift that needs to happen in the next 5 to 10 years that you think will completely change the way that you tell stories? And I'm curious to understand what you think that thing is going to be that's going to make the significant difference. I'm going to start with you, Oggy, because you look the most thoughtful.
But that means I'm ask me the question again, go on.
Well, what do you think is going to be the significant change, cultural or technological, that's just going to change the way that people tell stories or that storytelling occurs?
I'm going to say technological.
Okay.
Because I think playing around with the Alexa, one of the things that I noticed was that it removed so many barriers to interaction.
Yeah.
And I find that amazing that I can play a game while
driving or whatever,
or making some food for my kids.
Yeah.
There's no control pad to pick up. It's just I'm uttering a few words and I'm already in someone else's story. So I'm going to say technology for that kind of barrier to interactivity.
Okay.
I would go with I'd share technology as being a thing, but I would
okay,
for
you're not
different
allowed to say
reasons.
technology.
No, I think immersion. I think the idea of whether or not it's virtual reality, where because my issue is always the case of I can sit down my PC and I could start playing a game, but I'm very acutely aware that I'm just kind of sat in my office chair, kind of looking at a monitor. Yeah. I think when you start putting a headset on and you start looking around you and you start seeing this world which is kind of stretching out in all directions, I think it's a lot more powerful about that sort of what could happen in there and how you feel about being in the middle of it as well. So to me, I think the technology which allows greater immersion, I think can be utilised to tell even more powerful stories.
Okay. Jim, you're not allowed to say technology.
Cool, blimey. That's some lovely stuff there. Well done, guys. It's been a lovely podcast. We'll see you all next time. I'm joking, sorry. Damn, nearly got out of it then. No, I think it's fascinating to see if we can see a cultural shift in sort of mainstream media towards, and I can see this happening now, towards better storytelling. Okay. So I think we've been through a period, so moving away from games and going to, say, TV, we've seen mass hysteria over an indulgement and engagement with non-storytelling, so content that's just generated through celebrity and
reality TV.
Yeah, reality TV has been the last sort of 15 years since the early 2000s and probably beyond. And you can see now the quality of drama, the writing, the investment in new TV shows on stuff like Netflix and even like on ITV and BBC, stuff being influenced by novels and really great writing. That's all coming through and being incredibly popular now. And that's growing, and I think that's a really interesting cultural shift. Gone through a period of sort of crowdsourced narratives that are made by people just existing on screen, and now we're going back to what it looks like, hopefully, is really well written, well thought out stories that have really engaging characters and fantastic narratives. And I really hope that there is a shift change there, and that is what's to come. And I think should be heartening for people that do that as a job, because I think that is what people are seeking, and hopefully that'll move out into other games as well, other media, I should say, like games.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this Digital Jam session. As always, we'd like to ask you to share with us your social media handle of choice so that our listeners can find out a little bit more about what you're up to. Would you care to share that with us, Pete?
Yeah, you can reach me on Twitter. My handle is hi_I'm_Temi. So feel free to drop me a message. We can talk story or game design, whatever.
Wonderful.
You can find me at thatmanjim on Twitter.
Okay.
And me on Twitter as well as at jagex_mark.
Okay. And is there an official Jagex or RuneScape handle you would like to share?
This at RuneScape.
Yeah, at RuneScape.
Is the main one, and there's a whole bunch of other games which you could find through that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us, and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. digitaljamsessions.com